disappointment, as it was put. Yeah, do book on this. I'd like to quickly come to our speaker tonight, and many of us will know Vadanya, and some of you have been coming, well, since COVID or before, might not have the great chance to meet him or listen to him in person especially, but is one of the most, well, certainly one of the most influential people in my Dharma life, and he's one of the, what I would call him, one of the great architects of our centre and our Sangha night format. So you would have all done an introductory course. So Vadanya is one of the great architects of the introductory course. So he's pretty much written the whole course. So we've all already benefited, even if you haven't met him, you've already benefited from his wisdom and his generosity of sharing it. And the Mitra course is kind of pretty much main architect behind the Mitra course. And the Dharma economy at the center. So this Dharma economy we live by, just like this, you know, a little miracle that works here. Well, that's the vision of Vadanya. And I could say loads more about him, but I know I'm eating into, all right. Yeah, I am eating into his time of teaching and sharing the Dharma, so I'm going to leave it there and just really welcome him back to the centre teaching in person.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm not sure whether I'm getting feedback. Is this thing on? Am I getting feedback from this mic? No? Okay. Okay, well, so yeah, as I say, thank you, everybody. And yeah, a very warm welcome if you are new to Sangha Night, if that's the first time you're here, a very warm welcome on a warm evening. So if you are joining us for the first time tonight, you've joined a sort of juncture. We've got a sort of two interlocking themes, and we've finished one bit of that and we're starting another. So the title of my talk tonight is Mind Reactive and Creative. And for the past few weeks, we've been looking at one of the great symbols of the reactive mind, the way the reactive mind works, which is the Buddhist wheel of life. And tonight I'm going to give a brief recap for those who've been here for that, and also for those who haven't, of where we've been, and also introduce the idea of something very different, the creative mind, which is much more cheerful and optimistic. So if you're new, you've joined at a really good time. You miss out on all the dark stuff and you get the good stuff. So yeah, the wheel of life that we've been looking at describes our usual existential situation. It describes the way we go round and round in our old usual patterns, reacting in the same way when the world pushes our buttons, by trying to grasp what seems pleasant, trying to push away what seems unpleasant, or trying to distract ourselves from what seems unpleasant. And that just leads us to do the same things over and over again, responding in the same way to what feels pleasant, what feels unpleasant. We go round and round and round. And we've seen that this wheel is driven by three animals, the three animals you see at the very center of that wheel, which symbolize greed, hatred, and delusion. Or maybe a bit more accurately, aversion, attraction, aversion, and the sort of delusion that accompanies those, that underlies them. So that's the center. And we've seen that the images in the very outside, there's a series of rather enigmatic images of all sorts of things. They describe the mechanism. They describe the way the wheel works. So they describe, if you like, how the way we act now is determined, unless we do something about it, the way we act now is determined by our past. When the world pushes our buttons, we do what we've done. So the way we act now is determined by our past. But the way we act now creates the future. It creates the future self, and it creates the world that future self lives in. And then, of course, that future self and that future world become our present. And unless we do something about it, we do the same thing again. So we go round and round and round, deepening our patterns, round and round endlessly. So that's the sort of wheel. Wheels go round and round. And we've seen that the sort of orange segments between the outer rim and the center, they describe some places that we can be, some states of being that we can inhabit as we go round and round on this wheel. So we can find ourselves at the very bottom there in a sort of hell, of just very unpleasant mental states. We can also find ourselves in a realm that's called the realm of the hungry ghost. And this is a realm of, if you like, inner emptiness, an inner emptiness that we try to satisfy with all sorts of things that can never satisfy it, and which in fact just make it worse. And it's worse, that's the realm of the addict, that's the realm of neurotic craving, the addict. But in a way, it's also, it could be the realm of the consumer, always grasping for more stuff, more entertainment, more pleasant sensations to make up for a sort of inner sense of emptiness or meaninglessness. So those are two realms we could find ourselves in. We could find ourselves in the realm of the animals, where we're basically just responding, looking after the physical. We're focusing on physical needs and pleasures with no higher goals and no higher culture. We could find ourselves in the realm of the Titans, which is up here at the top, towards the top, which is a realm of big egos in competition for power and status and influence, basically. We could even find ourselves in the realm of the gods, the realm of heaven, a heaven-like world of constant, refined aesthetic pleasure, with no challenge, no suffering at all. Sounds great. Sounds great. The trouble is that without some challenge, we can't gain enlightenment. We can't make spiritual progress without challenge. So although it sounds great, it's not a place that we can move on from positively, and we're bound to move on from it in a negative way because those lovely states can't last. And when they end, we can find that we've become too sensitive and too precious to cope with challenges and the inevitable suffering that's part of life. So we suffer even more. And finally, we can find ourselves in the human realm. That's it. Which is really the goal. This is a realm where there's enough challenge and suffering to allow us to practice the Dharma, where there's metta as well as the sort of competition of the Titans, where there's higher culture and higher goals, something higher than the physical, unlike the animal realm, where we're not swamped by overwhelming craving, as in the realm of the hungry ghost, and we're not swamped by just really unpleasant mental states. So in the human realm, there's a bit of all the other realms. We might have found ourselves in a few of them. You might recognize some of them. I've certainly been in a few of them. But the thing is, we're not stuck in them. We can get out. So I've likened this wheel of life to a computer game. It's a computer game where we're in a ramshackle ancient castle full of tunnels with dungeons and dining rooms and kitchens and magnificent halls and beautiful chambers. And we can find our way from one chamber to another and do all sorts of different interesting things in different parts of the castle. We can play all sorts of games. We can score all sorts of points, get all sorts of treasure, and we seem to be getting somewhere. But so we might find ourselves in a magnificent throne room, sitting on the throne. But then a trap door will open and we'll slide down into a cold, wet dungeon eventually. We might think we're doing really well. We might think we're scoring lots of points in the games, but the points don't mean anything. They don't add up to anything worthwhile, and we're bound to lose them sometime. Because this castle, that can seem quite attractive, is actually just a prison. And the whole point of the game is to find our way out of the castle. It's only when we get out of the castle that the real game starts. And that's when, if you like, the reactive mind is no longer in control and the creative mind starts to make positive things happen. So 2 weeks ago, Satyajyoti told us about the door out of the castle, the way we can escape from the castle. It's in the outer rim of the wheel, somewhere around here. It's the point where we have a choice. It's the famous gap that we've all heard about on our introductory course. It's the point where, when the world pushes our buttons, we have a choice between acting in our usual way, grabbing what seems like a pleasant sensation, or pushing away what seems an unpleasant way, or we could decide to do something skillful and creative. We could decide to be reactive or creative. If we're creative, if we're reactive, we go round and round. If we're creative, that leads to better outcomes. And when we do that, we step off the wheel for a while. I don't think we sort of suddenly get off the wheel. Like, sometimes it could be presented like, now I'm out of the wheel, woo, some sort of spiral. I think, we make excursions. We make excursions. For the time being, we spend a lot of the time on the wheel, but we found a door. We found a door that leads to the fresh air, and we can go out into this wonderful new world and see what it starts to be like. And when we do that, every time we do that, something wonderful starts to happen. We start to benefit from progressive conditionality rather than sort of circular reactive conditionality. In circular conditionality, we do the same old things, and the same old things happen over and over again. Our ruts get deeper and deeper. But when we're creative, when we do something different that's skillful and creative, we set off chains, if you like, of progressive conditionality, where one good thing leads to something better, which leads to something better again. And things just get better and better rather than just going round and round. So the 12 pictures on the edge of the wheel of life, they represent what are usually called the 12 nidanas, the 12 links. Nidana means, I think, link. So we have a string of 12 links that join up together and normally keep us chained within the wheel. That's the most common representation of that sort of reactive conditionality. But in the early Buddhist texts, the Buddha tells us about several other circular reactive sets of linked states that can take us round in circles. Some of these other chains seem, I think, especially relevant to us today and to the very polarized world we live in. So there's a wonderful sutta, or discourse. Sutta means thread or discourse. There's a wonderful sutta in which the Buddha is accosted by a certain Dandapani. So Dandapani means stick in hand, or holding a stick. So the stick is so much part of Dandapani that it's become his name. So we can imagine him getting on a bit in years. I speak as one who knows, who stomps around with his stick. And the discourse paints a picture of, frankly, a grumpy old man, a grumpy, opinionated old man who likes an argument. And Dandapani goes out for his daily walk, thrashing things around with his stick. And while he's out for his walk, he runs into the Buddha. He's not come to ask for a teaching, he just runs into the Buddha. And he asks the Buddha in rather a challenging way, I think. A challenge, not a request. What is your doctrine? What is it that you proclaim? And the Buddha replies, I teach the doctrine, friend, where one does not quarrel with anyone in the cosmos, with its gods and demons, with its contemplatives and Brahmins, its royalty and common folk. Such is my doctrine, such is what I proclaim. And the sutta tells us, when this was said, Dandapani the Shakyan, shaking his head, wagging his tongue, raising his eyebrows so that his forehead was wrinkled in 3 brows, left leaning on his stick. Great description. It's a great description. We can just imagine him. He was not pleased. He was not pleased to be told about avoiding opinions and arguments. So that sutta is one of a group, actually. It's one of a group of discourses in which the Buddha looks at our views and opinions, how these arise and how they reinforce themselves, and how they lead us into more and more delusion and more pointless conflict. He makes a particular point about conflict. So he tells us that our views and opinions are based on our likes and dislikes. And he describes how our views and opinions determine how we interpret our experience, what we choose to see and how we choose to see it. So that what we see always confirms our opinions. So we go round and round, our opinions, digging in behind our opinions, getting deeper and deeper trenches behind our opinions. And he describes how this leads to us building what you could call castles in the air of ideas. It's there's mental proliferation. The term that's used is prapancha, mental proliferation of ideas, sort of castles in the air that can get more and more divorced from reality. So we go round and round, and he talks about this as what he calls the obsession of views. And he says that it leads to, in his words, taking up weapons, arguments, quarrels, disputes, accusations, divisive tale-bearing, and false speech. So everything from wars to bad-mouthing people who disagree with us, everything between. So these sutras, I mean, I suppose they tell us how 2 perfectly intelligent people can end up with completely opposite views and then fall out about it. Losing sight of their common humanity. So those sutras describe a reactive wheel we can get trapped in, another reactive wheel we can get trapped in. And the Buddha tells us that the door in this different wheel is not to build castles of ideas based on our likes and dislikes, but instead to look directly at the feelings of pleasure or discomfort and not react to them, stay above them. So this is another version. It's very similar to the teaching of the gap, where we experience pleasure, discomfort, but we don't respond to it. So both the wheel of life and the chain of reactive states that lead to conflict are both examples of the reactive mind. They're examples of the reactive mind setting up these circular sort of reactivity, circular conditionality. We react according to what feels pleasant or unpleasant, and that leads us round and round in circles. So what happens when we get off those wheels and behave creatively rather than reactively? Well, what happens is we can set off a different sort of nirvana chain, a different sort of linked chain of states. We can set off a chain of states in which one good thing leads to something better, and then this leads to something better again, in an upward spiral, leading us towards enlightenment. So as with the reactive circular change, there are several different upward spirals described in the early Buddhist texts. The one that's best known in the Triratna community is again 12 links that lead all the way up to enlightenment. But there are several others that maybe are more apposite to us, I don't know. But at the moment, several that we can learn from and apply ourselves in our practice. So one that I think might be particularly relevant to a lot of us is described in a discourse about a certain Visakha. So Visakha is one of the Buddha's foremost women householder disciples, and she's very generous. She's very generous. She's a very generous supporter of the Sangha. So she appears in several suttas, several discourses, and from these we get the impression of a rich, busy woman, very involved in worldly business. So in one story, she goes to see the Buddha when she's just been to see the king, and she's disappointed and frustrated by this visit to the king because he wouldn't see her, and he didn't want to see her about the business that she was involved in, that she wanted his support. So we see a busy, important woman, distracted by her various concerns, sometimes frustrated by them, who doesn't find it easy probably to find the time or peace of mind to meditate much, like many of us today. But Visakha is very generous. She's a very generous supporter of the Sangha. She provides robes for the wandering renunciants. She provides food for people when they visit the town. And she provides foods for monks when they set out on their various journeys. She provides food and medicine for the sick. And rather amusingly, I thought she provides bathing cloths for the nuns, because the nuns have to bathe in a place used by what the sutta calls the harlots. And the harlots make fun of the nuns when they're naked, so she gives them some robes to wear. And the Buddha she goes to see the Buddha. The Buddha praises Visakha for all this generosity, and he asks her about her practice. How do what's your practice? And she replies, my practice starts by thinking about the benefits my generous acts bring about. I imagine hungry travelers eating my food. I imagine sick monks being relieved by my medicine, and so on. And I allow that to make me feel happy. I become aware of the benefits caused by my generosity, and I'm glad. I'm glad and I'm happy. And when my mind is happy, my body is tranquil. And when my body is tranquil, I feel physical pleasure. I feel pretty, sort of almost thrills in the body. When I feel that, my mind becomes concentrated. And when my mind becomes concentrated, I can meditate, and that strengthens the spiritual faculties in me, and also the spiritual powers, and also the factors of enlightenment. So here we have a series of linked positive states, with one good thing leading to another, starting by the simple act of Visakha thinking about the effects of her generosity. So Visakha chooses, in the midst of her very busy life, to sit and imagine the effects of her generosity, rather than perhaps doing what might seem like the most obvious thing to her, which is probably most inclined to do, which is get on with some business. So she makes that choice, and that creative act leads from one thing and another, from one thing to another. Imagining people benefiting from her generosity makes her happy. And that leads to her body becoming calm and tranquil. And that leads to a state where her mind is still and concentrated enough to meditate effectively. And that leads to the strengthening of her spiritual faculties, she says, which are mindfulness, energy, faith, one-pointedness, and wisdom. And it also leads on to the factors of enlightenment. There are 37 of them, so I'm not going to list them. And also the spiritual powers, and I don't know what those are, and I didn't bother to look them up. So. But it leads on to lots of positive things. This very simple act leads on to through this sequence of events, sequence of states, leads on to very positive things. One good thing leading to another. So there's an example. There's a very good example of creative conditionality that maybe some of us could try. maybe some of us could find useful, especially if we live very busy lives like Visakha. You could try it, something like that, to kick off your metta bhavana, for example. Imagine the effects of some positive action. Allow yourself to feel good about it and see where that goes. Allow that to lead on to happiness, pleasure, relaxation, who knows where. You have to let these positive change happen once you've started them off. You can't make them happen. So you might want to try that at home. So we hear about another chain of progressive positive states in a discourse about a man called Mahanama. So Mahanama, he crops up several times in the early texts as well. And he seems to be one of the Buddha's most important male householder disciples. So he isn't one of the hardcore homeless renunciants. He had a family, he lived at home, and he had to earn a living to support them. Now, for most of the year, the Buddha and his renunciant followers, they lived this wandering life, walking from place to place, begging for food, often sleeping out in the open. But that wasn't always possible. As summer arrives, the great subcontinent of India heats up. And as that happens, massive towering clouds form. And it rains. And it rains, and it rains, and it rains a bit more. The fields turn to mud and the paths become virtually impassable. So then the usual way of life of the Buddha, wandering way of life of the Buddha and his renunciant followers becomes impossible. So for about 3 months of the year, the months of the monsoon, the Buddha and his followers would leave their wandering life and settle down in one place in huts and shelters provided by their householder followers. And when we meet Mahanama in this discourse, the rainy season is just drawing to an end. And the Buddha and some of his renunciant followers have been spending the last few months, the months of the rainy season, in Mahanama's hometown. So for several months, Mahanama has been living in the company of the Buddha or near the Buddha. He's had access to the Buddha and some of his developed followers, some of his highly developed followers. So he's been in contact with people who inspired him. He's been inspired to meditate, probably. He's had lots of opportunity to listen to the Dharma and to discuss the Dharma. So it's in his mind. It's perfuming his mind all the time, perfuming his thoughts. And the example of what he could become is right there in front of him all the time, before his eyes, in the person of the Buddha and in the person of some of the Buddha's followers. And probably, this is speculation, but probably he's also had much more free time to practice because, well, I don't know what he did for a living, but he was probably a farmer or a trader of some sort. And farmers can't plow in the rainy season and traders can't travel. So maybe he's had a lot more time to spend with the Buddha and his followers. For several months, he's been in splendid conditions for the spiritual life. But now the rainy season is ending and all that is going to change. The Buddha is going to leave and Mahanama is going to go back to earning a living if he hasn't been having to do that. He's not going to have that inspiration anymore. And he doesn't want this to happen. He's been experiencing these highly positive mental states and he doesn't want to go back to his normal mental states. So he goes to the Buddha and he asks him, at the end of the 3 months, at the end of the rainy season, when the Blessed One sets out wandering, in what dwelling place should we live? Well, that sounds like an odd question because it's the Buddha who's leaving and Mahanama who's staying. Mahanama and his friends are staying in their dwelling place, Kapilavastu. But what Mahanama, of course, is asking is, where should our minds dwell? Where should our minds dwell? When our minds no longer, as it were, dwell on you because you're here. Dwell on the Dharma because we're hearing it all the time. Where should our minds dwell? How do we keep our minds dwelling firmly on positive things? And the Buddha replies, these are what it says in the sutta, in the translation I've got. Firstly, you should recollect the Buddha. When a disciple of the Noble Ones is recollecting the Buddha, their mind is not overcome with craving, not overcome with aversion, not overcome with delusion. Their mind heads straight based on the Buddha. And when the mind is headed straight, the disciple of the Noble Ones gains a sense of the goal, gains a sense of the Dharma, the truth, gains joy connected with the Dharma. In one who is joyful, rapture arises. Rapture is physical pleasure. In one who is rapturous, the body grows calm. One whose body is calmed feels ease. In one at ease, the mind becomes concentrated. So once again, we've got a series, a chain of linked positive states, which starts by calling the Buddha to mind, imagining the Buddha. And if the mind is dwelling on the Buddha, on the ideal, then we're told it's freed from craving, aversion, and delusion, which of course are the three animals at the center, at the very center of the wheel, the three things that drive the wheel of life. And then he says, the mind heads straight. I like that phrase, the mind heads straight. Our mind is always going somewhere. It's always heading somewhere. And often it's just zigzagging between different bits of mental proliferation driven by our aversion and attractions. But if the ideal is at the center of our attention, then our mind heads straight in that direction. It heads straight. So we get a sense of the goal, he says, because we're heading straight towards it. We get a sense of the goal and how much we want it, how wonderful it would be. How wonderful would it be to be enlightened, or even to be further towards enlightenment? Just imagining that. We want it so much, and we always move towards what we want. And that, we're told, leads to joy and physical pleasure, which in turn leads to calm and ease, so the mind can become focused in meditation. So there's another example of a positive chain, a positive nidana chain, that could be relevant to our practice. So Mahanama, I think he was a lot like a lot of us. He had to combine his practice with worldly responsibility, family, and so on. So the Buddha's advice to him might well be relevant to us. And this practice of mindfulness of the Buddha, recollection of the Buddha, it's always been important in Buddhism. It's always been important in every school of Buddhism. We could try it ourselves. When we sit down to meditate, call the Buddha to mind. Imagine that we're in his presence. And see if that creative act sets off any positive consequences. Or we could do the same thing with any figure that inspires us. Or even with an image of ourselves as we could be. There's a saying in the Dharma, what we dwell on, that we become. What we dwell on, that we become. What we keep in mind, we move towards, so we become it. Our minds head straight towards it. So there's a few things in common between those two positive nidana chains with Visakha and Mahanama. So one is the mind is focused on something positive, focusing the mind on something spiritually positive and letting that lead on. But in the case of Mahanama, he focuses on the Buddha, on the symbol of the goal, the ideal of what we could become. And that's, I think, an especially powerful way of setting off creative conditionality. So there's one description of the wheel and the junction, the sort of fork where we can get off the wheel, which says that how we respond to dukkha, how we respond to suffering or unsatisfactoriness is the fork. So we can, what do we usually do? Distract ourselves. Let's turn on the telly. Let's have a beer. We distract ourselves from even that minor dissatisfaction of boredom. We don't want it. Let's do something different. So we either distract ourselves in some way with craving, or we blame, it's their fault, it's their fault. And when we do that, of course, we just go around again, craving or aversion, we're still on the wheel. Or we can respond to dukkha, to what's unpleasant, dissatisfaction, with what's called Shraddha. Usually translated as faith, but I think that's quite a bad translation. I think of it as sort of a thread that connects us to the goal that we're sort of dimly aware of, that pulls us. I think our relation to the Buddha and the goal is like the relation of an acorn to an oak tree, okay? So an acorn is not an oak tree, but an acorn has got a natural urge to grow towards being an oak tree. And I think we've got a natural urge to grow towards enlightenment. Acorns have oak nature, oak potential. We have Buddha nature, Buddha potential. It's part of our nature to grow towards enlightenment. And we've got, I think, if we can become aware of it enough, an intuitive sense of that, which can guide us. I think one of the keys of the spiritual life for me is to pay attention to that. It's going to be subtle perhaps, but it's intuitive. We sort of know the direction we're supposed to go. Very often things give us a clue about that, like something will seem fascinating. I mean, I remember when I first came across the Dhamma, I didn't know anything about it. I came across really rubbish books about it, and it just seemed totally fascinating. I think that was something saying, hey, come on, this way, not that way, this way. So I think paying attention to it. And yeah, I think one of the things, the reactive mind is responding to the past, right? The reactive mind is responding to the past. We respond to the present in the way that the past has taught us to do. And that keeps us going round and round in circles. I think the key to setting off the creative mind is to allow ourselves to be pulled toward the future, to be guided by what could be, not by what has been. And I think then when we do that, we set off all sorts of chains of creative conditionality. Creative conditionality can be magic. And it's said of the magician Merlin that he lived backwards. So he started out as an old man and got younger. Well, I think that's a sort of metaphor for the fact that he was guided by he was guided by the future rather than by the past. Where normally our life is lived from the past to the future. Let's live it from the future, what could be, to the present, and wow, magic will happen. Thank you.